Dobré dopoledne. Good morning, everyone. I welcome you at our final project presentation called Minority Stress in Czech LGBT plus people. What have we learned? Most of us are probably online, so I'm greeting also the online audience. My name is Michal Pitoňák, and I was the principal investigator of this research project, or the research project that was called Minority Stress in Non-Heterosexuals in the Czech Republic. And I'm very honored that I can welcome my colleagues, Martin Čihák and Zsófia Csajbok. And I'm very happy that I can introduce you Professor Sharon Horne, who is going to give us a presentation today later. So hello to you, and thank you for being with us here today. So your presentation will be in the latter part of our event today.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for inviting me. I'm so honored to be here with the National Institute of Mental Health, and just thrilled to be here to learn more about what you've learned.
Thank you, Sharon. So I will be giving you some first thoughts, and I will tell you how the presentation is going to be structured, and you will be seeing my colleagues over the course of the presentation. So thank you for being here. So my pronouns are he, his, and him. And if you want to address us during the presentation, you can write your questions within the WebEx platform, or you can raise your hand. But generally, we are trying to have a discussion after each of the thematic blocks that will be presented. I'm very happy that at this presentation, we can also have a company of artistic presentations, representations of the issues that we are going to talk about. And those of you who are here with us can see them in the corridors, and you can take pictures with these artistic representations. And I would like to thank the intern at our organization that was helping with these illustrations, Queer Geography, and the intern Barbara Gaďorková for making these presentations, illustrations possible. So today we have a packed program because this research project was occurring over the past 3.5 years. And it is the first research project that focused on the well-being and mental health of sexual minorities, non-heterosexual people, LGBTQ people in Czechia. And so we will start by introducing of some key terms, some key concepts. Then we will tell you about our research methodology, about the project sampling, about the sample of participants that we gathered. And then we will present you 4 studies that we were able to complete, or are we about to complete in the next few days. And those will focus separately on different issues that we've investigated. We will have a pause somewhere in the middle. And after presenting of our studies, we will have an invited presentation of Professor Horne from the Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts. So let's delve into the key terms and concepts. So within this project and within this presentation, we understand sexuality as not only individual identity, but also as a complex social relation, which is similar to other axes of human difference, such as class, gender, and race. And we want to acknowledge that there are multiple ways in which we can refer to people who do not identify as heterosexual or straight. And we may call these people either sexual minorities, non-heterosexuals, or we can use identity terms if these are appropriate for those who we are addressing, like gays, lesbians, bisexual people, queer people, pansexual, asexual, etc. Similarly to sexual diversity, we need to acknowledge that there is also diversity which goes beyond the sex binary. So we have also intersex people. And we also have people who surpass the binary understanding of gender. So we have gender diversity in form of trans people, also non-binary people, agender people, gender fluid people, and others. These are all within the society, and sometimes we forget about these groups, and our project was very much designed to include them. So just to say about some of the numbers, these parts of societies are very important because it's at least 5 to 10% of the world population that is estimated to comprise of sexual minorities. Whereas, and here the estimates differ based on the definitions, and we have yet to learn the actual numbers, but research somewhat agrees that at least 2% of people are gender diverse, but I would say the number is larger when it comes to the definitions. First important term that we need to introduce, because it will interconnect some of the presentations, is stigma. And there are a number of definitions, stigma, that followed the original research of Goffman. And some of those definitions agree basically on that stigmatized individuals possess or are believed to possess some attribute or characteristic that conveys a social identity that is devalued in a particular social context. So it is a matter of devaluation of someone's identity, someone's value, and it's a matter of power within a societal context. So another and most used definition today is definition of Link and Phelan, and they apply the term stigma when elements of labeling, stereotyping, separation, status loss, and discrimination co-occur in a power situation that allows the components of stigma to unfold. So you see they are all interconnected, and they are important for us to move on with understanding of some of the issues that are part of our study. So stigma also been found to work at multiple degrees, multiple scales. So generally, within the societies, within the cultures, we can speak about the systemic or structural stigma, which is legitimized within the laws, within language, within the cultural norms. And these are known to sieve through into the interpersonal level. So because of the society is prejudicial, because the laws are discriminatory or missing, this can allow for some collectives, like school collectives or work collectives, to sense these power relations, and then they can give rise to school bullying or discrimination at work. We have then the personal, the individual effects of this stigma, and these take multiple forms, and this will be part of our presentation, so we will speak about them in detail. But generally, they can be like sexual orientation concealment, gender identity concealment, etc. So another important term, not just stigma, is stress. So we all know stress, and I think I don't have to introduce stress in deep. Typically, it's understood as something that is connected only to individuals. So you lose your job, you have some difficulties in your family, and then you have some problem that you have to adapt to. That's general understanding of stress. But some of the stressors have a source outside of your smaller environment. They have a source within the society, and for example in stigma. And these stressors being found to be socially based and are connected to stigmatization, prejudice, discrimination, and therefore by the theoreticians who've started to invest their interest into sexual and gender minority well-being, they recognized that this kind of socially based stress is important for us to focus on. So generally, stress has a negative impact on health because it requires us to adapt to it. So we need to invest our psychological and physical energy to cope. And these coping processes do cost us some of those resources. And if the stress is too long and too high, it can lead to severe problems. So this is general understanding of how stress is impacting our health. There is another type of stress which is part of our research, and that stress is the minority stress. And if you see the picture, then you can see that there are people who are in color within that group, and those people are a minority within that group. And these people do have to cope with additional stressors, not only those that everyone copes with from time to time, job problems, issues within the family, having some conditions, but these people are socially stigmatized and they face some problems in their environment. And because it is very difficult to change the environment from one moment to another, we understand this stress as chronic and societally based. So there are, of course, minorities that are that face the minority stress, and these can be ethnic minorities too. They can be religious minorities as well, because they can be rejected within their communities, for example. But there are particular specifics that are only occurring within the sexual and gender minorities, and that is because even within the family context, being someone who is not heterosexual or someone who is not cisgender means that you can be a surprise to your own family. They don't count with you from the start, so they are not your support group, for example, and they may not recognize this. So these specifics make it very special to the sexual and gender minorities, and you can also by yourself internalize those societal views and stigma. So then we speak, for example, about internalized homonegativity. But we will speak about these in detail later on, but I just want to give you more examples of what I meant now by those differences between different minority groups. So for example, an ethnic minority that is minority within a given culture, within a given context, is typically supportive of their kids because they are together an ethnic minority. So this is what is different, because they are giving support from the start to their kids. Similarly, a religious community can be a minority within a given society, and they, of course, parents do support their kids when it comes to their religion. But as I said, often if you are growing up as non-heterosexual, as trans person, it's your parents who don't know about you, who are also not knowing about your difference. So this is something that has to be overcome, and it's an additional, a specific issue. But of course, everything is intersectional, so you can have sexual minority who is ethnic minority at the same time, who is also religious minority. And I think this beautiful wheel of power / privilege by Sylvia Duckworth is a very interesting picture which shows that there are multiple ways of marginalization, and these intersect within a given individual within given society. So it's just, I want to acknowledge intersectional concerns. So minority stress been originally conceptualized by various authors, but it was Ian Mayer who has actually put it into the papers to put it a big framework, which is very used since early 2000s or late 90s. And in his understanding, he distinguished between minority stressor that can be understood as external to individual, that are further from our bodies, such as discrimination that originates externally to our bodies, or some events or even laws and attitudes of others. And then, so these would be the distal minority stressors, and then he understood the proximal stressors as those who are individual-based, who are subjective, and who are influenced by our individual perceptions and appraisals. So it's very about how they do differently affect us, and we differ in ways in which we are affected by those minority stressors. So there are examples of these processes, like, for example, everyone differs to the extent to which they internalize societal norms, to which they may feel rejected and may feel anxious about that rejection, to the extent to which people are aware of the stigma around, and to the extent to which people want to negotiate their concealment or disclosure of their sexual or gender identities. So general, sort of very simplified picture could be that the stigma is at the beginning of the problem, and it causes minority stress, which eventually may, through disruptions of functioning of psychological problems, lead to risk of developing mental health issues, which in turn can have irreversible mental health outcomes. And this is, of course, a very simplified picture, and I have to acknowledge that our study was a cross-sectional study, and so we are not going to speak about confirming some causal inferences, but we have a lot of literature that is based in enough data which has enough power to have this kind of proof. So this is the early conceptualization of the minority stress by Eileen Mayer. And I don't go into these processes again because I already explained the picture. And so I just show another conceptualization which was put together by Nathaniel Lewis. He's a geographer of sexualities, and he's interested in health geography. And here you can see some of those processes that at the beginning really it's stigma in the left down corner, and there are multiple ways through which the factors influence individuals so that the health outcomes can become irreversible, such as a suicide, for example. So this is basically what we want to study, how we want to understand what's happening. Like, we want to really understand those lines and understand the processes. Hopefully you will get some understanding on at the end of our presentation from the perspective of Czech society. So generally, we have to acknowledge that stigma needs to be recognized as a very important factor that influences health of people at the population level. So it's as important as socioeconomic status. If we know that in some region, some country, there is a high stigma, we know that people will be less healthy. The same way we know that if somewhere people are poor, they will be less healthy. It's that easy. But more difficult is to do something about it and to understand those processes, exactly how they are influencing each other. So that was actually the first major extension of the minority stress framework that originally identified that there are minority stressors, either proximal or distal, either individual subjective or objective external to individuals. And that was, so how do these actually influence the processes that we share, all the processes that we share, how we handle emotions, how we cope, how we understand the environments around us, the cognitive processes, how we basically work generally as humans, as humans that have psychological functioning. So one of those frameworks that wanted to connect those two specific theory with the general theories was the psychological mediation framework, originally introduced by Hudson Buehler in 2009. And he basically pointed out that there are like separate literatures and that we need to connect the dots so that we can speak about some more general framework. And that was the psychological mediation framework that you will hear much more about later on because we were trying to use it. But generally, it is about connecting the general psychological processes, as I told, with those group-specific processes and understanding how these interact, how these are in together affecting the mental health in people. And his major contribution was to show us the difference between whether some processes do mediate some effects, so whether they are activated, changed by some events or something within the environment, or whether they act more as a moderator, so whether they make something worse or less powerful in general. So these were the main lines of the psychological mediation framework. And today, a lot of research is focused on this, and there are a lot of studies that focus on, for example, how the psychological problems are being connected to some of those issues related to negotiation of someone's sexual identity, or how it's connected with relationship problems. A lot of research was focusing on the psychological well-being, psychological distress. Also, there's a lot of research that was focusing on, for example, how those minority stressors are influencing the substance use patterns in people, or how it is connected to suicidality, and how it is, for example, connected to issues also like mental health problems and substance use, and within the larger framework. So these rather bold models are trying to figure out how these come to influence us within the everyday environment. So we were trying to do something similar in our country for the first time. So as I already introduced you, my colleagues, we together within our project that started in 2019 wanted to test whether the minority stress framework and psychological mediation framework as an explanatory model, whether it holds in the Czech culture, whether we can apply it as an explanatory framework, whether it's applicable, whether our culture is not different in some ways, so that it is, because the cross-cultural validations are not so widespread. So we wanted to basically see whether the theoretical framework is robust enough for being applied in our culture. So at the beginning, and I want to acknowledge help of Dr. Pitoňák from the Yale College, who helped us at the beginning with getting a sense of what kind of measures being developed within the research in this topic. And since he's one of the pioneers within the field and developed some of the measures himself, we invited him in 2019, and he was giving a presentation here. So it was also a big help of Professor Pitoňák at the beginning of the project. So now I will lead you through some of the measures that were part of our project. So of course, when we were trying to understand sexual orientation, we understood it as a multidimensional construct. So we measured either self-identity, behavior, and attraction. Then we measured different aspects of sexuality and used different measures on gender identity as well. We were looking at, we've included measures on general health, and we included a general measure of on psychological distress, which I will be telling you a bit more about within the study that focused only on that. We also measured perceived stress, we measured life satisfaction, we saw social support as a very important factor that is buffering against, as you will see, much of the minority stress. Then we focused on those general psychological processes, especially those that are connected to coping and emotion, so rumination and emotion dysregulation. We've also included specific measures that are only focusing on some processes that have been found to be unique to LGBT people, and I will be talking about those in detail within our first study that will be introduced soon. So these are the processes that will be introduced within the first study. We included an important measure on rejection sensitivity, which is a very important almost a framework today, an explanatory framework that is being almost like as important as the main minority stress framework itself, because rejection sensitivity has been found as an amazingly important process that mediates the relationships between the distal minority stressors and the proximal minority stressors and general stressors. And we will be talking about these in the study number 4 in detail. So we included several measures. We developed also a special measure on subjective awareness of structural stigma, so an extent to which individuals are aware of that the society is being stigmatizing. We'll be talking about that a bit more within the study number 4. And we've included a measure on the discrimination and heterosexism within a society, heterosexist harassment, rejection, and discrimination scale, which is very widely used within this field. So we wanted to have a backing of a measure that is recognized and functioning within the field. And we also use other measures that have not been found to function so well as we wanted them to. So we are only going to present you some studies that are really backed by valid and reliable measures. We also focused on the alcohol and substance use measures, but those will not be part of today's presentation because we already focused on them in our previous ones. So some of the measures had to be uniquely adapted into Czech. So we followed some good practices of how to adapt the measures into Czech language and into our cultural context, which was actually quite an important goal. And we spent almost half a year on adaptation of those measures. So I will just give you an example of the adaptation process that we had an item within the rejection sensitivity measure. There was, you are in a locker room in a straight gym. One person nearby moves to another area to change clothes. So those of you who understand Czech can read those different translations because we had 4 different translation experts, and then I was harmonizing the translation together with them. And it was quite tough, for example, in this item because Czech language does not have a word for straight, which would be similar to its English variant, whereas the very understanding of a straight gym made no sense in our language. So we had to go around it and figured out how to do it. So we generally translated it into a typical fitness, which was like, or a common, I would say maybe a common is a better translation of běžného, which is in the sentence at the bottom. So translation was a very interesting project, and we were really focusing on it to make it well and make it carefully, because good measures are at the heart of our good practices. So now I'll tell you a bit about the sample and the participants so that you know on which data the whole 4 studies are based. So we created a questionnaire which was online, and we conducted it in December 2019 and February 2020, which I'm very glad that we did not do this research during the COVID pandemic time, but we were able to do it before, because I can say that our data were still not influenced by the pandemic, so they are grasping what the society was like before. And it was approved by the Ethics Committee of the National Institute of Mental Health, and we asked for to participants to provide informed consent via online informed consent. That there was a criterion before they could proceed to actual questionnaire. So at this point, I usually get a question about, okay, so it was online, it was convenient sample, so it is biased sample. And we have many experiences with biases in LGBT plus research. And since there is a lot of experience within this research, there is also a lot of literature that's covering these issues. And we were, of course, focusing on them in depth. And we are trying to do the best as possible to have a sample which is robust and still not representative, because it was important for us to be able to collect a sample that includes participants who are in enough numbers for us to allow to disaggregate into different groups. Because if we had only, say, 200 people out of the general population sample, which would be probability, then we couldn't do analysis to separate, for example, bisexuals from gays and lesbians, and we couldn't possibly detect some differences between trans people and cis people. So it was very important for us to focus on the subgroup differences as well, and that's why we resorted to a convenient sample, which by research that focused on the comparisons between the convenient and probability samples in the LGBT studies found to be powerful enough to test the theoretically based hypothesis. And we can say that despite the sampling bias, the analyses that we conducted were in line with the best practices. And there's plenty of literature. I can recommend those of you who would be more interested into how to overcome the biases. So, having thought about these limitations, we did our sampling as best as we could. So we contacted many community organizations and asked them to help us with the campaign. We created an identity of our questionnaire so that we had a lot of advertising, different types of pictures, different types of content that we also printed and we also used in physical domain. So it was not only online sampling process, but it was also offline so that we could reach to participants who would otherwise not react to the traditional, for example, social networks. So we also printed cards, posters, and advertised to strategic partners via different networks and used also email lists so that we could, for example, reach to elderly groups and via some key informants. Doing this, we reached a sample that was nearly 1,800 people. It was 1,778 participants who can be distinguished based on identity into these groups. So, for example, if we see that men's and trans men's sexuality, they were mostly gay, bisexuals, pansexuals, asexuals, and other. Sexuality of women was rather more diverse, so we have more of the women who've identified as pansexual, for example, and you can see that non-binary participants did have very diverse sexual identities. Here you can see that based on gender identity, although it's not visible in the sexual identity picture, we had more women than men because there are more bisexual women than bisexual men within our sample. And this is a general picture that we can see also in other samples around the world in other regions. And when you see the sexual identity meeting gender, here is it. You can see that only 5.3% of the sample was bisexual men, while it was 4 times more bisexual women. We had around a quarter of lesbian and around 36% of gay. So there's like more men identify as gay than lesbians. more women identify as lesbians. So when it comes to age structure, of course, as in all LGBT samples and online collected samples, the sample is a bit younger than would be the general population sample, but this is typical for the samples that we've done in this country so far, and I'm only looking forward to seeing more and more inclusion within the groups above 55, which is always just about like some 70 people plus, but the number is growing over time. When it comes to geographical structure, I was rather satisfied with the distribution because the distribution was not so far from the distribution of the population. So, of course, we have most people coming from Prague, but almost all regions are represented in enough numbers. But we did not do specific geographical analysis anyway. Then when it comes to occupation, we had a lot of students, of course, because the sample was a bit younger, but also people who were in their productive lives. And when it comes to economic status, it was quite representative as well. Religious participants were only 13%, which is somewhat in line that sexual minorities are less religious than the straight and cis people. So, this was the general introduction into our sample, into our methodology, and now I will start with the study number 1, which we did with my colleague Martin Čihák. And basically, at the beginning, we realized that a lot of things that we want to measure are related to specific LGBT sexual minority identity issues. So we used lesbian, gay, and bisexual identity scale as an important tool that's been recognized to be able to focus on specific LGBT issues, but it was not yet adapted into Czech. And since our environment might differ from those other environments, we wanted to really psychometrically understand that. So together with colleague, we were working on this for some time, and we are happy to show you our results. So generally, those differences, those questions where we started to question whether it's applicable to use the tool that was developed in the West to measure LGBT identity, we wanted to see whether it's not different in our country, because our country is relatively different from other countries in the West when it comes to acceptance of LGBT people. It has a different environment, and there are different patterns of civil society organizing, which may affect, for example, the community organizing. There are different levels of religiosity and different kinds of discourses that course throughout the society. So we wanted to understand whether this has some impact. First, we wanted to explore the theoretical foundations of this scale. We adapted it into Czech. We adapted only 6 scales, as you will see soon, and we explored its validity based on comparison with other measures that we included, and we evaluated whether it's really functioning the way it is supposed to function in our sample. So it has to be said that this measure does not focus on measuring the extent to which someone identifies as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. This is not what the tool is about. And neither it focuses on evaluating some stage of coming out, for example. It's not what it is designed on. Instead, it really is designed to focus on a variety of negative and positive socio-cultural dimensions of wider LGBT+ or non-heterosexual identity. So what is shared instead of what is specific for someone. So the original scale consists of 27 items divided in 8 subscales. I will show you all the subscales in the next slide, but I have to tell you that we excluded 2 of the subscales from our adaptation, and one of them was identity uncertainty. Because the inclusion criteria for being included in our sample was based on agreement whether someone is agreeing with being regarded as LGBT+. So we felt that this might bias the understanding of this measure, so we would not be able to detect those things. And we also excluded items from the identity superiority scale, which was found by other adaptations as having problematic reliability. And also, we did not have enough theoretical understanding of how we could introduce the measure into it was not a focus of our research. So now I'll introduce the rest 6 subscales, and then I will hand over the time for my colleague who will tell you a bit about the psychometric method that we use to explore it. So here you can see the distributions always of each scales, and the first one is about acceptance concerns. So, for example, a typical item would be, I think a lot about how my sexual orientation affects the way people see me. So it's closely related to those expectations of rejection, or this understanding of how people think of sexual minorities within a certain environment, and how they understand the potential of being stigmatized within that environment. So here you see a pretty normal distribution, whereas you can see differences between subgroups within this box plot diagram. So it's mostly similar across different subsamples, with slight differences, but my colleague will tell you more about it within this psychometric analysis. Another was connected to concealment motivation. So this is I think very straightforward. Example item would be, my sexual orientation is a very personal and private matter. So it's sort of a potential for disclosure and concealment within different kinds of environments, and it is connected to this individual's need and understanding to how much they want to conceal. Again, you see pretty normal distribution, and we actually included another measure in our study, so that to be sure whether we are measuring it well enough, because it was one of the central pieces of the whole project to understand it. Again, you can see very, very similar distributions. Of course, the sample sizes were different between different subgroups, but they did not differ so much. There is generally rather a tendency for concealment. The higher the score, the more concealment, of course. Then there was a measure of internalized homonegativity, which we talk about in detail, because this is exactly one of those processes that we knew that might work differently. From the start, we knew that we need to investigate it, because it's a lot of people talk about it, but what it is exactly. So this construct, this scale has approached it, for example, by a measure. If it were possible, I would choose to be straight, for example. It was typical measure of it. So it's a subscale focusing on the extent to which someone internalizes the norms that are anti-LGBT within the society. But let's see about that in detail. You can see that there is a very high level of disagreement, so it's very skewed, but we will talk about it in our results part and in the analysis part. Identity affirmation is another somewhat opposite to internalized homonegativity, but it's something that we have to have a continuous discussion about whether we can approach it in this way. But an example item would be, I am proud to be LGBT. And again, this is often associated to positive thoughts and feelings about one's sexual orientation or membership in the LGBT community. And again, we knew that maybe this is a problematic subscale, and we see what we learned about that. Here you can see a rather agreement with it, and you can see some differences between subgroups, but again, we will talk about this in detail. Then a very important aspect of measurement someone's identity is how central one's sexual identity is to their general identity. So identity centrality is trying to figure out that. So for example, an item would be being an LGBT person is a very important aspect of my life. And here we can again see quite normal distribution, and the subgroups did not really differ much in here. So there are people for who the centrality is the sexual identity is very central component, and there are people for whom it is really not very central component, and somewhat most people are in between. And then there is this last subscale focusing that generally it is something that is noteworthy, that is important for someone to be non-heterosexual, be sexual minority. So recognizing of that it is not easy to be sexual minority within a certain environment, the difficult process scale is focusing on that. So it's focusing on that, like people have to go through some process. It's not something automatic, and how difficult it is for, again, each individuals you see. Again, there's this almost normal distribution. So I will hand it over now to my colleague, Martin, who was doing the confirmatory factor analysis, and floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. The mic is working, so so far so good. As Michal said, identity is something that is really influenced by culture. So if we want to say that there are some shared dimensions of identity, then we have to test it, actually. We have to confirm it with our data. Here we have the model that is actually the same as the original authors used. So here we have the 6 shared dimensions, the dimensions that are the same for all LGBT plus people. And we wanted to test if this model holds also within our Czech, Eastern European cultural context. So if you're not familiar with confirmatory factor analysis path diagrams, this basically tells that, for example, identity centrality is measured by items number 7, 10, 15, 17, 18, and so on. Here you have some numbers, and those numbers tell us how well does this model, this original model, fit our data. And these numbers are actually quite good, with exception of this first one, root mean square error of approximation, which is, let's say, borderline. So we decided to test some additional models to look for some better fitting models, and here are they. And I wanted to say that actually we used some robust estimator because of those 2 scales were not normally distributed, but that's a technical detail. As I said, we tested two more models. The first one, we decided to merge identity affirmation and internalized homonegativity into one dimension. Why? If you think about it, it kind of makes sense, because those dimensions are opposite in a sense, and they even correlate highly. Yes, the correlation is 0.75, which is a very high correlation. So we wanted to know if this model, where we have just one dimension merged, identity, affirmation, and internalized homonegativity into one factor, whether it is a better model. And those numbers tell us that no, it's a worse model. So we decided not to use this one, but definitely because of the high correlation between those two factors, we can say that there is a huge overlap between those two factors, those two dimensions. So we tested one more bi-factor model, and in this model, as you can see, the identity, internalized homonegativity is measured not only by the original items that were meant to measure internalized homonegativity, but also by the items that were meant to measure identity affirmation. And basically, what does it mean? It means that this dimension, internalized homonegativity, measures not only the unique information that is bound to identity, that is bound to internalized homonegativity, but also the shared information. So this IH measures both the unique IH and the shared information that is for IH and IA, identity affirmation. And this model has better fit. Those numbers are better than the original 6-factor model, but unfortunately, in this model, identity affirmation is not measured reliably. It has McDonald's omega only 0.4, which is quite low. So at the end of the day, we decided to use the original 6-factor model after all this struggle. So yes, the original 6-factor model can be used within our Czech Eastern European cultural context. Then we looked at validity of the scales. Validity basically means whether the scales measure what are they supposed to measure. And in 4 out of those 6 scales, there were no issues with validity. But in identity, again, those two problematic guys, identity affirmation and internalized homonegativity, we found some issues with validity. And why? The first reason is that, as Michal already said, both of these scales are skewed. If you look at those distributions, they are quite skewed. And why is it a problem? The problem is that in ideal world, if you have two people that differ, for example, in their internalized homonegativity, you want them also to differ in the score. So if, for example, I would have high internalized homonegativity as someone else would have low internalized homonegativity, you want us to differ, for example, to have a different number of points. But here, as you can see, most of our sample had 2 or 3 points. So the scale is not able to discriminate between two people that have different internalized homonegativity. The same holds for identity affirmation here. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that both of those scales have 2 similar items. They have very, very large correlations. In internalized homonegativity, it is, if it were possible, I would choose to be straight. And the second one, I wish I were heterosexual. The wording, the meaning of the items is very similar. And in the second scale, it is, I'm proud to be part of the LGBT community, and I'm proud to be LGBT. So these are very similar items. And again, why is it a problem? The problem is that, again, in an ideal world, you want different items to aim at different aspects of the construct, so that in some you have covered like as much aspects of the construct as possible. But if you have like 2 almost identical items, then you aim at the same aspect. So that's a problem. And the final problem is that if you look at correlations of internalized homonegativity and identity affirmation with other scales, then there are no significant correlations, for example, with stress, which we would expect. And there are, for example, with emotion dysregulation, also the correlation is not significant. So those scales do not correlate with measures of some constructs you would expect to correlate them with. Okay, and the reason why those two subscales have some issues with validity, well, we don't know why, but our theory, do you want to, or shall I? Okay. Okay, so maybe I will start and Michal will say something more. The reason might be that English-speaking countries and our Czech post-socialist Eastern European country, well, we have some differences, some cultural differences. And the main cultural difference is that our country is secular. We don't have as much religious people here as in the West. And we have a very prominent sexologic discourses. Pupils in elementary schools learn that sexual orientation is innate, unchangeable, something that is not like a sin or something like that. So those items that aim, for example, if you remember some of those here, if it were possible, I would choose to be straight. It might not be applicable here in the Czech Republic because people would say, okay, it doesn't make sense. It's not possible to be straight. I was born gay and that's the way it is. So that might be the reason. Another one, another difference is in the wording of some of those items. Because in English, as you might have seen, there are words like pride or community, but in Czech, those words, I think, personally, have different connotations. To be a part of community in English is a different thing than to be a part of community in Czech. So that might be the differences. And we think that, for example, in the Czech context, internalized homonegativity might benefit rather from items that aim, for example, for self-restraint of sexual identity, rather than to change of sexual identity.
Yeah. So to add towards that understanding, we generally found out, or our theory, our explanation of our, thank you, Martin, is that the very understanding of being LGB may actually overlap of understanding of being part of community in the Czech language. So if someone says or agrees with, I'm part of the community, many can understand that they are actually acknowledging that they are LGB. Yeah, we have a comment, sorry, yeah, of course. So here you are. We have Zdeněk Sloboda, a researcher focusing on this in the audience. So.
Yes, I'm Zdeněk Sloboda. I'm from Palacký University and doing like research on LGBT for quite a long time. Isn't the main problem the sample? Because when you have people that are engaged online, they more or less need to be somehow okay with their identity, so they don't really feel that much homonegativity because they are in some phases of coming out, and therefore, and also people that are on a proud NGOs, pride events and stuff, they kind of feel that they are part of the community. What I think most probably you don't have enough people in the sample that kind of are gay, are kind of okay with that, but they hate Prague Pride, for example. They hate to go anywhere. They hate the gay clubs. They hate the community, the scene. They don't like the scene, but they are gay and they're okay with that. So that would be probably for me, the sampling would be the main problem with these two scales. They are skewed that much. And because for example, currently I'm doing research with Czech LGBT Vietnamese people. And I'm working with the concept of tacit subject. So they're like, they kind of know they're homosexual. They don't really feel it is okay, but it's like it's not right, but it's okay. So they have kind of this, they kind of like dance around the identity. They are not telling it anyone. They don't meet anyone really. They are sometimes on like dating apps or something, but they're not really engaged. And I think such people would not have chance to kind of participate in your research because you will not approach them because the way the sampling is, and it's really hard to do like the sampling for LGBT people. So
thank you,
this is my question.
Yeah, thank you, Zdeněk. This comment is of course very valid, and we are actually this is a potential cause of that we didn't have enough variance in the participants in the internalized homonegativity, of course, and we are acknowledging it in our limitations. And I would partially agree with that, but partially I would still think that this may be it, because if you are asking people whether, are you part of the community? Thank you. So I will just comment to the other part as well. But if you ask people here, they don't really distinguish between being part of the community and like members of some certain group and being gay or being lesbian. It's like, it's within the discourse, within the culture, it's like the same. Like, I'm part of the community. It doesn't mean that I participate. It doesn't mean I'm going to Prague Pride. It just means to them that they are gay, for example. This is our theory so far, and I would think we can explore this in further research, like especially media-informed research would be very important for that. But of course, our understanding of the sampling biases is also supporting your idea. But here, when it comes to the distribution, we included a scale on community participation. And so, although people online will not see it, but you can see its normal distribution. So we have people who have both been active within the community and both being not active. So on this kind of explanation that it's because it's biased for only the active people within the community, which we were really trying to not have that kind of bias, I think we can support a conclusion that this is not the cause of that kind of. So that would be the community effect, and then I would say there is also effect of pride, which in Czech people do not understand the same way as a concept it developed in English. Because in English it overlaps very much with understanding of solidarity, of understanding of that someone reached to a point where they accept themselves and feel similar to others, and it's nothing to do with some feeling of superiority over others, which may be some of the Czech translations, like you feel that you are proud, like as in bragging, as in being more than someone else, as in, yeah? And this is maybe also a confusion within the linguistic differences of those languages. And we are not ready to answer these questions by our study. We are only ready to ask those questions. So we are welcoming linguists, media professionals, and people who want to explore those questions in more details, because our research is suggesting it's needed. So I would end it there, but I would also encourage everyone who is connected online so that they can write in their questions to the platform, and so we can have time to answer those. And just to add towards our explanation about the unchangeability where it's come to internalized homonegativity. So there were people having high level of disagreements with statements like, I wish I was heterosexual, or I would rather, if I could, I would rather be straight. So as Martin already suggested, we think that this is much influenced by the Czech cultural context, a cradle of sexology, where these positive affirmative discourses have been spreading for a long time. And so the very idea of that sexuality is unchangeable may be so strong in our culture so that people rather disagree with the very idea of that changeability rather than they would understand the question as an actual option to, if they could, they would. So we also feel that this is maybe why the actual items might not be working so well. Nevertheless, they worked in some ways, and we are just not sure if they worked perfectly and if they covered the construct. Yes, Martin?
And maybe if I can
Yep,
add
come here so
something.
that people can see you.
Okay. I think, and I already mentioned a bit, that in Czech cultural context, like measuring internalized homonegativity would benefit from those or items that would aim at those behaviors you mentioned, like I'm gay, but I don't like Prague Pride because I'm not part of the community. I'm just gay, and I'm not ashamed of it. But if I don't know, a guy polish his nails, that's strange. I don't like it. So maybe those items that would aim at those behaviors or those thoughts might be better than the original items in our cultural context.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we need to develop these kind of measures that would be probably more sensitive in the future. Hopefully more research will focus on that in the near future. So now I still feel we have time to speak about the study number 2, and after the study number 2 we will have some pause for refreshment, and it will be 20 minutes. So also for those who are online, you will have some time for relax in between. So our second study was focusing on a larger issue of dismissing the problems of non-heterosexual, sexual minorities, and trans people's well-being within the society. Basically, we were trying to point out to the invisibility of these subgroups within the society. So together with Professor Kožený and Martin Čihák, we were conducting a comparative study. And we really wanted to make the first step to show that we do not have enough inclusion in the sampling and in the data collection to actually be able to compare the general population or the heterosexual population health, women, men, with the non-heterosexual, sexual minorities, and trans people. So what we did, we wanted to bring the attention to this problem. We wanted to illuminate that there are some differences and what these differences might look like in well-being, psychological distress. And we wanted to say clearly that we need more data about this, so that we really wanted to point out the issue. So we all know now from the literature that's rich, that's been on within the worldwide publishing environment for like at least 4 or 5 decades now, that really sexual minorities and trans non-binary people do, because of the stigma and minority stress mainly, suffer from more problems of psychological well-being, more concerns when it comes to suicidality. There's several times for the higher suicidality we will talk about in our study number 4. And and then there are problems with other issues that are here and there entering the public discourse. Like, for example, not long ago, it's I think like 2 months ago, we had a very nice podcast called Cult, which was focusing on the body image and potentially the eating disorders, etc., within the gay men subculture. So, having said this, you already know about what our sample looked like. So this is the red sample in here, and we also had a general population sample that was collected by my colleagues, Dr. Čemi and Professor Kožený, in 2016, in their study in which they culturally adapted the brief symptom inventory to understand the psychological distress in Czech society. So we had the same measure in our sample. We used, for these reasons, we used the same measure so that we would be able to make that comparison. So brief symptom inventory is an 18-item measure that was originally designed to measure 3 different aspects of psychological distress. It was supposed to measure anxiety, depression, and somatization, but its Czech psychometric evaluation discovered that due to really high intercorrelations between those subscales, it was not very good to use those different dimensions. So we were, based on that Czech adaptation, recommended to use only the measure of general psychological distress, which further on we will abbreviate by BSI 18 within the rest of our presentation. The measure is based on measuring the distress from 18 points to 90. This is important so that you know about these points, because when you will see the results, the numbers, we will be speaking about the differences in these scores between groups. So here you see a picture that we were able to construct based on the comparison of the samples, the general population sample and our sample that was LGBT plus, and here you can immediately see something interesting. So we have so clearly the distress gets higher as in a direction towards the general population sample, gays, lesbians, bisexual men and trans men, and bisexual women and trans women have the highest psychological distress according to this. But here I want to point out that our general population sample only allowed us to group general Czech sample of men and general Czech sample of women. And obviously, since that sample did not ask people for their sexual orientation and gender identity, both general samples must include also sexual minority people, so that these actually include all of the 4 other groups. And that's the major problem we want to point out, because we cannot, based on our currently available data, do a comparison. Because, and of course, all of those people who would say, this is a biased community sample, whereas this is the representative probability sample, we would love to compare based on the probability sample had it actually included those measures in the first place. So they did not. So we can only say that there are differences, but we can presume that these differences are probably higher because both groups of men and women from the general Czech sample already include those that we have in the subsamples. So we did hierarchical linear regression models, whereas in the first model we only compared the subgroups. We didn't control for any other variables, whereas in the model 2 we held for education, net income, and religiosity, which were the only demographic variables that were present in both of the studies, so that we could control for them in both of the studies. And based on the results, you can see that really all non-heterosexual groups had higher BSI 18, so higher psychological scores in comparison to the general population sample. And the most difference was in bisexual women and trans women, who had, on average, by 11.9 points more psychological distress on the scale from 18 to 90 compared to the general population sample. So it is, we have the numbers. We know that the problem is focused mostly in bisexual women, but still you can see that it was a 4.8 in gays, 8.2 in lesbians, and 7.0 in bisexual men and trans men. You might ask why we combined the men and trans men within the bisexual groups. We did so to include the trans participants, because otherwise we wouldn't have enough power, statistical, to include them. And we were aiming to include those groups based on their self-identification, and it was based on some discussions within the community that they would wish to be put together with groups that they identify with. So we wanted to affirm that. But there were only 44 participants and 14 participants in the trans groups, men and women. I see we have a question. So
I have a microphone.
Oh, you have a microphone?
Do you have also the bisexuals kind of like, it would be a nasty word, clean from the trans men and women? Because I assume that like the trans identity is very stressful, going through the transition, or like kind of getting to wanting to be in a transition is kind of a little bit more stressy than just like being bisexual cis man or cis woman. So if you have also the sample clean from that, if it's still like that different from the lesbian and gay sample, I would be interested. Thank you.
Well, I don't remember the numbers for the psychological distress, but when we look at suicidality, which we will talk about in, I don't know, a few minutes, then we have transgender participants separately, and yes, they are much higher than bisexual participants. So we will see that on suicidality. Oh, well, yes. Michael said that. Michal said that we didn't have that much, because if we separated trans men and trans women, then we have like a very few people there. So that wouldn't be a reliable analysis. So in suicidality, we group them together.
I understand that for like bisexual trans men, trans women would be like a very small sample, but I would be interested in just like bisexual cis men and bisexual cis women, if I assume that the trans people will kind of, I don't know what's the proper English word, would like drag the stress, bias it like a little bit like higher.
Suicidality study.
Yeah. Okay.
Here it is basically about the comparison, and we did not feel it's so important to exclude. It felt that it's rather important to include than to clean them, because otherwise it would... in the suicidality study, it was much more important to have the exact numbers, because there the trans identity itself was important. So having said this, we've already mentioned that all non-heterosexual groups differed from the perspective of psychological distress from the general population sample, and that we can clearly say that bisexuals experience more elevated level of psychological distress, which was actually confirmed by a number of studies. It's a clear-cut pattern that we can see within research, and we are talking about that in our study. And those potential reasons for higher vulnerability in bisexuals been also researched for some time. There's much more research we need to conduct, which you will see in the study number 4, in where we are trying to understand more about the processes within our sample. But here I can just recapitulate some ideas, some processes that were identified by former research. Generally, bisexuals face more pronounced experiences of stigma and related to discrimination. They are more intensely erased from the society and also from the community. I sometimes would say that it's L, G capital, B small, and then T capital plus, because B is really, there is really just a little attention to the bisexuals almost everywhere. We only write it with the capital B. And there's a lack of bisexual affirmative support. And there are also other sources of negativity, B negativity. I don't know if we pronounce it bi negativity or B negativity. So bi, thank you. And it's contestations of bisexual identity authenticity. This is something that I am registering also within the local scientific discourse. There's not enough affirmation towards the bisexuals' identity, so that they are actually existing and not problematic, but that they should be affirmed as they are and understood as they are. So, and also, many people do see and view bisexuals, people's sexuality as deviant or hypersexual. And for example, there are some discourses within the society that consider bisexuals as less loyal partners, less stable for relationships, etc. Yes, Denku.
I'm sorry. Can I have just question? No note. Have you thought how have you thought about the difference between men and women, bisexual men and women? Because in Czech Republic, when we look at the research, usually women are more easily identified as bisexual. We have higher samples of bisexual women as men. Men usually identify as gay or straight, and there's a very small portion of bisexuals, yes. Whereas among women it is kind of easier. So how come when they identify that easily with bisexuality, they are more stressed of it? Is there something with the femininity in it? Is there some aspect that I don't know the scale that you have measured? Is the scale somehow sensitive to gender topics? Is that they're motherhood or some other kind of cultural stress imposed on them or not?
Those are excellent research questions for the follow-up project, because we are scratching the surface now with it, and I totally agree. We were in our fourth study, you will see that we focused on bisexual women also, but this is so vast, so we need to ask those questions and do research specific to that. It's really, we can theorize, of course, we can do our literature reviews, but this research study, this questionnaire was long enough with the measures we included, so we did not include those who, we had to stop somewhere. But those are excellent questions, I think. So, moving on towards the finish of our second study, which will be the just before the pause, which we will have, we have now clearly proven that we need to collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity within the surveys that are focusing on mental health and on psychological distress or any other research that is relevant. And so here I would like to just make an intersection with another project that I did together with my colleague Marcela Macháčková, and we just currently published a Czech methodological book in which we are trying to fill this gap, trying to say how to include measures on sexual orientation and gender identity, which measures that are evidence-based and ready to include into various surveys can be selected. And we are providing a manual also about the sampling, about all the biases, all the actual types of problems every researcher, every institution may encounter at the process of willingness to include those measures, because I think that's the main prerequisite. So these books are here also for you to take away if you are interested in including those measures. And I would already say that the next upcoming mental health survey by the National Institute of Mental Health will include these questions, and I'm very happy for that, because there will be possibility to disaggregate the sample based on at least sexual orientation, which is a big step forward, because we'll be able to do that disaggregation. A small step, but one of the many we need to take. This is a study that I conducted with my colleague Martin Čihák, and our big aim was to really start to consider this issue as issue that it needs attention because it's overlooked so much that we need to focus on it. There are stories that have reached the mainstream in many countries, but I somehow feel these stories are problematic in a way because they are highly medialized and in the suicide studies, we can speak about that medialization is not a really good thing in suicide, and then it's a very difficult to consider it. But there are a lot of LGBT people who are losing their lives because of suicide in different countries, and we are yet to understand fully the extent of this issue. So in this presentation, in our work, we want to give credit to critical suicide perspectives. And this is specifically important within the queer youth suicide studies because there's a lot of research that stems from minority stress theory and psychological mediation framework that stays within the domain of mental health in the individual discourses, in the discourses that tend to identify the maladaptations and pathological traits and pathological processes that are taking place within the individual. And so they focus only on these processes and somewhat forget that suicide is taking place in a wider context that we need to understand more, and that's which is actually more important for us to focus on. So we need to really ask questions, not only whether do some people feel sad or depressed or have suicidal ideas, but also why do they feel the way they feel, and what's the society around and their groups about. So there's a number of books, a number of publications that I want to acknowledge that we focused on and we've considered. And these are all considered quite topical within the network of critical suicide studies. So for example, McDermott and Rowan, in their book Queer Youth Suicide, ask question, could there be some clues about the processes and mechanisms which link experiences of victimization and suicidality, which are beyond the individual mind, something that really goes beyond the individual scope? Or they continue, we, like other critics, argue that an individual's emotional state of mind cannot be maintained independently of the society in which they live and the people they may be connected to or disconnected from. This idea of connectedness, social connectedness, is so important within the critical suicide perspectives that we really wanted to focus on it also in our study. And so, for example, they also say, quote, Fulagar's research, and I like this quote, that suicide is not so much a desire for death, but rather occurs in the absence of desire, or where connectedness is severed. So here again, another quotation by Rob Cower, who used Edwin Schneidman's theorization of suicidal behavior as constituted within society, within sociality, and argued that a suicidal queer youth does not seek out death per se, but seeks to escape from the complex tensions that are produced in subjectivation. Obviously, we would need to do some queer theory, some Foucauldian understanding of the subjectivation processes, and we do not have time for that here. But I want to acknowledge that we need to look outside of the individual's concerns, and we need to invite disciplines such as sociology, gender studies, queer theory, geographies of sexualities, and other disciplines that really focus on the external. And we can do transdisciplinary focus, I believe. So, having said that, we still needed to measure the suicidality in some way in our sample online. And so we used the Suicidal Ideation Attribute Scale, abbreviated as SIDAS, in our sample, which was found to be quite okay for self-report online use. And this measure includes 5 different items, 5 different subscales. One focusing on the frequency of suicidal ideation, another focusing on the controllability of that ideation, then focusing on closeness to a suicidal attempt, level of distress related to suicidal thoughts, and impact on daily functioning, impact of that suicidality on the daily functioning. So we've adapted this measure into Czech, and first we had to find out how well is this psychometrically working. So again, I think it's the good time to give the ground to Martin, who can give you a little bit more information about the psychometric adaptation of our measure.
So very quickly, because I believe that psychometrics is not the the most interesting part of the presentation, but still, we try to test whether those five items really measure one common thing, namely suicidality, and we've done that again through confirmatory factor analysis. And as you can see here, those numbers they are excellent. So yes, these five items do measure one common thing, and even with very high reliability. But if you look at the distribution of the score of the SIDAs, you see that it is very, very skewed, and this is the first reason is that suicidality is some extreme behavior. It's not like common, it's not normally distributed in the population. But the second reason is that if we look back here, if a participant responds never on the first item, so they say that they have never in the past month any thoughts about suicide, they automatically are given 0 points, and they are not administered the rest of the scale. And this fact might inflate some correlations between the items, so we decided to do the analysis again only with participants that did not respond never, that respond at least with some suicidal ideation. And again, these numbers are good, with exception again, with exception for this number, which is very, very high, far beyond any recommended cutoffs. But if you look at the residual covariance metrics, for those of you who are into statistics, those residual covariances are not like that high. The residual correlations are less than 0.001. So I think that it is acceptable to use this model and to say that these five items measure one common thing, namely suicidality. So here are again correlations with other measures that measure some related constructs. All of them are significant and in a predicted fashion. So the scale seems to be valid. Yes, maybe this is you've already seen this is the stress scale. This is another stress scale. This is satisfaction with life. Of course, if you have like there is a negative correlation. This is rumination, emotional dysregulation. This is the heterosexist rejection and discrimination. This is loneliness scale, and this I don't remember. Rejection sensitivity. Thank you. And these are measures of social support. So that was the less interesting part of our analysis. And the more interesting part is why, first question is, why do people want to commit suicide? What are the factors that might influence suicidality? And the second question is, are there any differences between subgroups of LGBT plus community? We used, because of the extreme skew of the distribution, we used median regression with bootstrapped standard errors, because normal, ordinary least square estimator wouldn't be or would be very biased here. And the reasons are as follows. Oh, no. First, the groups. I'm sorry. First, the groups. We categorized our participants into these groups. We were inspired by this study by Horne and colleagues, who found significant differences of suicidality between trans participants and cis participants. We had many cis participants, so we categorized them more finely, not one big cis group, but we categorized them into gay men, lesbian women, bisexual women, other cis women, that mean not lesbian, not bisexual, and we grouped together bisexual and other cis men because we had a small number of bisexual men. So here are the differences. As you can see, here is the score. The score ranges from 0 to 55. 55 is maximum on this scale, and as you can see, trans participants, other than lesbian and bisexual cis women and bisexual women, all have comparable suicidality. These are 99% confidence intervals. And then we have bisexual and other cis men, gays and lesbians, who have significantly lower suicidality. So, and this is, I think, in accordance with what you said previously, that trans participants are like stressed more than other groups. But if we remember what Michal said about those critical de-individualizing discourses, we wanted to understand which above individual factors, that mean not factors that are within the individuals, but can be attributed rather to society, culture, and so on, might influence suicidality. And we added those factors into our model, namely loneliness, social support, relationship status, heterosexual harassment and rejection, structural stigma awareness, mental health care availability, and the fact whether those participants were educated about sexual orientation and gender identity during their sexual education. That's the word.
Yeah, this is important that we are grouping these three extra individual processes into these different groups, because the red group is connected to the social connectivity and that kind of domain. Then we have those distal minority stressors like the structural stigma awareness and heterosexual harassment. And then we have these specific extra individual factors that we wanted to investigate, like the access to mental health, whether they had some care, and etc. And then inclusion of the sexual orientation and gender identity topics within the. Maybe you can say a bit about how did you categorize those responses into the two green categories?
You mean, yes, mental health care availability. We had three groups of responses, or three responses. The first one was that the participant does not need any health care. The second one is that he needs some mental health care, but it is not available to him or her or they. And the last category was that they receive some mental health care. So there were three categories. And the second one was either the gender identity and sexual orientation topics were not included at all, or just one of those was included, or both.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's those responses. In sexual education in elementary schools, higher education.
Or general education.
Or general education.
Within this elementary school.
Because somewhere it might be, I don't know, in science and classes and so on. So I think someone is
Maybe
trying.
they will go around.
Okay. So here are the results. We found that suicidality is significantly linked positively to heterosexism. The more heterosexual rejection and harassment, the one is subjected to, the higher the suicidality.
Which is generally the measure of discrimination.
Then we have a positive correlation with loneliness, with receiving mental health care. Here, as I said, we had three categories. And this is like those who receive mental health care have higher suicidality compared to those who do not receive mental health care, which is like logical. And the last group had even higher suicidality, but there was a high standard error, so it was not significant. And it is negatively linked to social support from family. And these factors were marginally significant because those p-values are between 0.01 and 0.05. We chose our confidence level to be 0.01 to have a more robust results. And the very interesting part is that if we adjust for those factors we just mentioned here,
the extra individual factors,
above individual factors, then the differences between groups become non-significant. What does it mean? It means that the differences between those groups can be explained by those above individual factors. And this is very important for working with LGBT plus community to
depathologize them as well, and to consider those external factors and differences in those different external factors as the main foci.
Yes, definitely. So it's not like that, like because you are trans and therefore you have high suicidality. It's rather because of the above individual factors that are causing, probably, this is not an experiment, so it's just a cross-sectional study, but probably causing the higher suicidality. So as I said, some LGBT subgroups are subjected to more intense influence of risk factors. And we can see it on those plots. For example, heterosexist discrimination and rejection. As you can see, trans people are subjected to significantly higher discrimination compared, for example, to gays. The same, or the opposite holds for loneliness. Gays, lesbians feel less lonely compared to trans or other than lesbian or bisexual women. Here we have social support from family. Again, gays have much higher social support from families compared to trans or other than bisexual or lesbian cis women. Here we have social support from significant others. As you can see, again, there are differences. Maybe those are box plots. I think that all of you know what box plots are, but these, I don't know how to name it, these...
Quartiles?
Sorry?
Quartiles?
No, quartile is here and here, but in Czech I would say zobáček. So these are 95% confidence intervals around the medians. So if, for example, we have here, there is a significant difference between these two groups. And here is the structural stigma awareness. As you can see, gays are less aware of structural stigma compared, again, for example, to trans participants. So that's it, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you, Martin, for the explanation of the analysis, and I think we've really supported the theory within the critical suicides explanation frameworks, and we want to continue with that kind of research. And here I want to acknowledge that there are interventions available today, specific interventions. So for those who might be threatened by the suicidality, I can recommend a project by organization Prague Pride, which is called Zbarvou ven, which is an online chat helping service. So those of you who would want to spread the understanding of this very important intervention, please know about that group. Also, Linka Bezpečí is a call line where adolescents can call for help, and the professionals working on that line are equipped with tools how to help them. And then I would like to focus your attention also to a side project result that we collaborated with Queer Geography NGO, and which is a so-called vyhledávač péče, which is a tool which you can use to find care providers for LGBT plus people or competent to give care to LGBT people. You just go to that website and it will help you to find providers based on criteria. For example, you need sexological help within the Prague region that is working with your insurance and for example, that they also cater online, and based on those criteria, they will find you. If you are not part of that, based on that website, you can only include input the survey information, and then you can be part of it. Do we have a comment, a question?
Yes, it's a question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's working.
It's working?
It needs to be read.
Yeah. Okay. I just wonder if there is, if you are aware of special education of these providers or people that are intervents on the crisis line, because you are proclaiming they are really prepared to provide quality care. But as far as I'm just very familiar with our curricula of different subjects in the field of sexology, I'm not really sure if we can expect specialized help for your target groups.
Okay.
So
yes.
Could you comment on this, or are you aspiring for doing some educational programs or methodics in this direction? Because
Thank you, Kačko. The question by Kateřina Klapilová, thank you. Yes, I would say partially equipped. There is some understanding at the Linka Bezpečí and Zbarvoven are attending a lot of education, but generally I would agree with you that we need to make a systemic change so that these kind of educational materials, this is more known. So another step after we completing the project would be making sure that this is translated into practice. So we have gaps in that.
Because what you are proclaiming and your results are confirming, because these are the perfect targets of therapy, not only of societal change.
Yes, yes.
So this should continue by development of the methodics for providers.
Yes. Absolutely. So I just, maybe you did not hear it online, that we will need to continue with this so that it's reflected within the practice, especially in therapeutical care. So because we are running out of time and I want to be in time, so I will just quickly run through our fourth study, which was maybe the most bold result of our research project, because we really, by our fourth study that I was collaborating with my colleague, Dr. Čajbok, and we together wanted to basically, on our cross-sectional data, within the limitations of being able only to test a theoretically based model, not a causally based model, we wanted to understand whether we can apply the minority stress and psychological mediation framework, as well as rejection sensitivity framework, towards understanding the variants of psychological distress within our sample. So I will just quickly guide you through what we found and what we did. So you by now know about our measures. You know how we included, which measures we included. So based on only 1,452 participants have actually fully answered the heterosexist harassment, rejection, and discrimination subscale on heterosexist harassment and rejection. So we only have this number of participants within this particular study, and that allowed us to actually conduct subgroup analysis only on 3 subgroups, which was gays, lesbians, and bisexual women. Other subgroups could not be present within this study because they were too little numbers of them, or they were included, but we did not do subgroup specific analysis on them to correct the statement. in here, I want to, and I will speak about the measures on the model that we did, because I think this is more interesting. So maybe, Zsófi, would you like to say something about the methodology before I talk about the actual measures? Just a few lines, some glimpses, some things you feel that are important to share. So, Zsófia Csajbok.
We developed this model, this PASS model, to test the mediation analysis that we hypothesized. And I think what are the maybe two key interesting points in this is that we developed it based on theory, because this is a cross-sectional data, so we don't really have actual longitudinal predictive value in it, because it's not that there was some intervention and afterwards we look at the outcome of said intervention, but we much rather just wanted to test based on going through how it would logically happen, and then we build the model as the theory suggested and how we felt it is logical. So this is one caveat. And another interesting part of the analysis is that this is a fully saturated model, so it has perfect model fit. Therefore, we can't say too much about whether it is ill-fitting or fitting with the data, because it is fully saturated. There is no gap in this analysis. This is technical detail, but maybe important. So the way how we developed the model was that first there is harassment and rejection happening in the society, which is going to predict people's structural stigma awareness because of the experience harassment and rejection in the society. And afterward, it is going to make them sensitive to rejection. And these are going to end up in two specific proximal psychological stressors.
Yeah, I can explain those. Maybe I wanted you to, maybe do you think the technical, about the amount of variance that we explained, which is interesting to the audience from this perspective, maybe if it's better for it, because I think we need to talk about those specific a bit more detail. So
I'll let you do that.
I will do that, yes.
Okay, so overall, the model explained over 55% of the psychological distress variance, which is a really good model. So it has a lot to do with this psychological distress that our sample experience. The second interesting result is that the whole model explained almost 10% increase in psychological distress. So as you go through all these events, like rejection and sensitivity to it, concealment, and all the rumination that you experience afterwards, this is all going to cause, by each increase of unit increase in this side, it will end up in 10% increase in psychological distress, which is, I would say it's quite significant, considering that this sample in the society is so vulnerable to all these things, and they're all they're all non-heterosexual. So I bet that if you compare them to heterosexual sample, this might be even bigger. That's my hunch.
So thank you for that, because I really think we need to stress that we have developed the model on theory, and that actually it is explaining pretty well the variance in the psychological distress. So just tell you, second thing, yes.
I forgot that starting from harassment and rejection, 71% of all affect is mediated by the mediation, so by the measures put in between harassment and rejection and the psychological distress. So everything, 70% of everything is mediated by all these aspects, and 30% is independently predicting psychological distress, which is again very, very interesting that, okay, there is a unique aspect of harassment and rejection that is not explained by these, but 70% is, which is quite a lot. So this is again something that is warranting some
Thank you.
Correct.
Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to underscore in this model before going into the details, basically. Because if you see the model, then you don't see the amount of theory that we tested behind it. So we basically approached it as, first, there needs to be an event that occurs within the society. You have to be somehow stimulated by a discriminatory event, for example. Someone rejects you from the family, behaves bad to you, you experience something. And then, in the second step, it makes you more aware to that this is happening, that this society is stigmatizing some subgroups, and you may, in the meanwhile, you may identify with this subgroup more. But the very awareness of stigma does not make you feel anxious about it. So perception of stigma is something that needs to be separated from the way in which is disrupting you psychologically, and that's the anxious component, which has been theorized within the rejection sensitivity framework, and that's why we put it as a mediator just after the first two, because after you are stimulated, after you have experienced some events, then you might be more probable to have some feelings of rejection that may influence your further psychological processes. So again, just stressing, this is not a causal study, it's a theoretical study, but we did order these things based on the former research and the clues that we got. And then there were these mediators so rejection sensitivity, internalized homonegativity, and concealment have been recognized by Mayer before as the so-called, or today we sometimes call it as the triad of the minority stressors, the proximal minority stressors. But since the concealment is so sophisticated, so complex, and it's becoming more and more theorized today, and thankfully to the, for example, field of geographies of sexualities, we know quite a lot about concealment and how people spatially, temporally negotiate it according to different contexts, which is just being picked up in the field of psychology, for example. We knew that it plays some role only after those other processes, and that it must be related to the internalized homonegativity in a bidirectional way, so that it's interacting with that in some ways. And that in general, it's only after these processes occur, they interact with, associate with, of course, this analysis, we only study the associations, but in real life, we expect these to interact with the psychological processes such as dysregulation, ruminatory thoughts about the processes, coping processes, and maladaptive coping, and then the influence of social support, generally diminishing the social support in those who conceal, so they do not have such access to, for example, community social support of significant others who may know about them that they need some support. So as Zsófi already said, those mediators have explained some 72% of the variance of psychological distress, and we believe that we can say, based on this, that a theoretically based model used on our cross-sectional data confirms that the minority stress and psychological mediation framework are applicable within the Czech cultural context for being used in other studies. And we of course, we detected that most problems were pronounced again in the bisexual women group, and that in the bisexual women group, some of those proximal minority stressors might work differently. But we will not go into detail about those within our today's presentation because we are, of course, running out of time. But I would generally want to acknowledge that there's much research needed about the these processes in bisexual women, maybe even development of new measures. So I would like to thank you for the time that you focused on our presentations from our projects. our project. And now I would like to invite Professor Sharon Horne, who is a full professor of counseling psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Please, Professor Horne, come to join us in the front in here. So her research, I will just stop sharing the screen, or maybe I can ask for that we change the proportion of the screen. Můžu poprosit o video z místnosti? Děkuju moc. So her research on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression related to legislation, policy, and transnational context concerns has been world recognized. From 2012 till 2021, she provided leadership as an elected American Psychological Association representative to the International Psychology Network for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Intersex Issues, the ISINET. She chaired the policy committee that drafted the ISINET statement and commitment on LGBTI concerns, an international LGBTI affirmative declaration that has been endorsed by 45, which is incredible, 45 national and international psychology organizations, and translated into 13 languages, which is like very, very nice. Thank you, Professor Horne, for that work. Dr. Horne is a global Fulbright scholar from 2018 till 2022 in Colombia, South Africa, and Philippines, and was an Open Society Foundation academic fellow with the psychology department of American University of Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan from 2005 till 2015. She received the 2020 award for distinguished contributions to the international advancements of psychology from the American Psychological Associations in recognition for her transnational work. Professor Horne, I really welcome you here, and I shall give you the microphone. Sorry for that. Thank you for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Okay. So let me... Thank you. Can you hear me? It's okay? Well, thank you so much for this invitation, and I just want to comment on what a phenomenal presentation of what a body of work that Michal and Sophia and Martin put together. It's so hard, first of all, to do work with this population. To do research in this area is a lot of energy and complexity and focus. You have to really work hard to reach our population. And second, they did this by using many measures that were in English that were then translated and tested and created versions that would work for the Czech population. And that's an impressive body of work right there. And then to capture all of the dimensions of cultural context and all the ways that this work is impacted by location and geographies, and then they touched on suicidality, and then they looked at subgroups, and then they have this tremendous model that's explaining so much of psychological distress with minority stress mediators, which is incredibly impressive and very important work. And it's an honor to be following you all today and learning so much about your work. I'm not going to talk long because we don't have a long time. I'm just going to touch a little bit on my work. And this drawing is my daughter did, who's she did it when she was 13, but she's at the Prague Zoo right now. So anyway, so again, yes, I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts Boston, where I do research in mostly two areas of LGBT work, mostly with intersections of structural stigma, but I also do work on access to treatment, mental health treatment, and client experiences of that treatment that they're receiving. So that's the kind of work that I'm doing right now in Colombia and South Africa and the Philippines. But I'm going to talk about stressors. So I'm not going to review all of this because there was such a dynamic job that was done by Michal and colleagues. So you're familiar now with minority stress and what that entails. And many of you already knew anyway, but just to point out that it's, you know, it's a taxing, chronic, socially based experience of stress that can be explained by all these mediators that that we talked about. So before 1973, at least in our country, we equated being homosexual with poor mental health. Right? The idea was that, well, if you are gay or lesbian, and people weren't really looking so much at bisexuality or transgender issues in terms of mental health at that time, but because homosexuality and gender dysphoria were pathologized. So it just meant if you identified with this population, you were experiencing poor mental health because of it, because of who you are. And now we've moved into more, we recognize that general stressors impact well-being. We know very well that in the general population, the more stressors people have, the more intense psychological distress concerns that they have. So now, when we think about stigma, it's in addition to general stressors that impacts well-being. And so as psychologists, we've often entered with the individual. So what is this individual experiencing? What is the individual, how badly do they feel about being LGBTQ? What is their experience of that? Without taking in the context of what we are breathing in any of our societies. So we're breathing in the whole world's understanding, attitudes, negative portrayals in the media, all the ways that we internalize negative attitudes towards us. And then, but psychologists have been very stuck on the individual without recognizing that we all absorb this. It's like pollution. We're taking it in, and you're going to take it in more in different places in the world, depending on where you're living. And so how do we capture this, moving it back out into the world, back out of the individual, recognizing that there'll be individual variations for what people are experiencing. So I don't know why that's done twice. So I'm going to go on. So, and the APA now recognizes this it's a very central piece of the new guidelines that have been put in place for clinical practice for for sexual minority persons, which is psychologists recognize the influence of institutional discrimination that exists for sexual minority persons and the need to promote social change. And what Michal talked about earlier was so much about intersectionality, so you can be sexual and or gender minority, but then also what's happening at your other intersections of your experience and your identity. And that can include especially location, country, where you are existing as sexual and gender minority. So my research in this area developed way back in 2000s when I was living in a part of the U.S. that is less supportive of LGBT populations in Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee. You know, Elvis, big film that's out now. You recognize it. So one of the things that I was a tenure track professor, and at that time the state had already said there could be no gay marriage, no marriage equality allowed in because they had signed on to this federal bill. But then they said, let's change the constitution of our state so that there'll be no way for this to pass. So this is an earlier picture from the 90s, but so I was reading the paper one day and I was like, wow, this is upsetting. There were ads that were coming out, and I was like, gosh, I'm getting upset about this. And I'm a pretty privileged person. I'm a professor. I'm out at work. What must it be like for other people who are experiencing this right now? And this was a whole wave of this stuff going on. Many states were passing these bills. So we along with other colleagues, we put together several studies that focused on people living in states where the ballots, there were measures on the ballot on the election that would pass these anti-LGBT marriage bills versus, and then we looked at this across people who were living in states who were LGBT, who didn't have these ballots on there. And we found that people were experiencing greater depression, greater stress as these bills advanced. And we did this pre and post. And then we also focused on family members, because it's a very interesting key point of this, because you're not, as an LGBTQ person, going through this typically alone. You have family members who often have a lot of ambivalence about, or even are rejecting, but how are they managing all of the increased media attention, the increased discourse, the increased conversations? How are they dealing with it? We wanted to know, were family members also affected by this? And indeed, we found that they were. We did both quantitative and qualitative measures and studies on this. So here's like an example from one of the qualitative studies. I essentially had a breakdown. This is a gay person after that election, and I'm seeing just one useless thing after another happening, and it really starts to sink in that, you know, these hopes I had as a child, these assumptions I had about my country, they weren't really real to begin with. You know, they just kind of faded away when seeing this. You know, since then it's gotten worse. I went into a deep depression. You know, I withdrew from everybody. I changed my major first off. I got out of politics. I said I just can't do this anymore. This is from a mother, a Tennessee mother, who shared that her son told me more than once, "Mom, that's only a part of my life, being gay. I know that, but I'm so disturbed and angry inside that if I don't act and I try to keep it in, it hurts me." And when I found myself out holding a sign up one day, and I'd always been your typical Southern woman, we didn't do that kind of thing. They didn't believe in protest. You know, it's not common to protest. You didn't want your name in the paper, and I'm thinking, I'm standing on this street corner protesting with a sign in my hand. And there's no going back for me now. I'll never be that woman again. I don't want to be. So here it brings us to today, where we are, and I'm going to talk about a recent study where we are experiencing an intense backlash and a full-out war against transgender people, especially youth, where they are trying to pass as many bills as they can in advance of what's happening in November, which is our midterm elections. So I have a whole lot of work that I've done on the use of homophobia and the use of transphobia as political tools. But this is an example of where we are today. We're in the United States. And so we are in the midst of this criminalization of trans youth, and it's a very convenient group to focus on because they are youth who can't advocate for themselves. There's a very small number of them, but they have passed through bills to take away. This was stopped by the Texas court, but to take transgender children away from their parents. It's still possible that this may come to pass. Banning treatment, this actually passed for transgender adolescents. Florida governor just signed a bill saying you can't talk about being, I like that you talked about sexual health. In Florida, you can't talk about sexual health before 3rd grade or you can't, they jokingly call it the Don't Say Gay bill. You're not supposed to be able to talk about anything about homosexuality to kids under 3rd grade. So, and then also other bills that are happening. So we had a bill that was happening in Massachusetts where we had full rights for transgender folks in terms of gender, for accommodations and housing and public access, going to restaurants and service. And a small group of voters tried to overturn that, because if you can overturn things in Massachusetts or California or very progressive places, then you have a chance to change things. So they said, let's put this to a popular vote. Let's see if we should be keeping these rights for transgender folks. And this was called the Gender Identity Anti-Discrimination Veto Referendum, which is a very confusing way to say we just want to take away rights that you already have. And so the purpose of that study was utilizing minority stress theory to look at whether this referendum was going to play a role in psychological health for folks. In particular, since it was targeting transgender people, we wanted to see similar why it's so important to do subpopulation work, within group work, because it was targeting trans folks, but it was likely going to have an impact on LGBT people as well. But you would think that it would have more of an impact on them. So we did try to do this. We looked at would they have more anxiety and depressive symptomology? Would social support mediate that? And if they had a history of gender-related threats and discrimination, would that play a role in their experience around the referendum? And would exposure to more ads, street signs, and conversations predict greater referendum-related anxiety, which would in turn impact depression? And then would they change after the election? So this is some of the media that was used to say that trans people were not safe, that they were just men who were just, going to go into women's restrooms, and it was playing on this whole, phobia and hysteria around trans issues. There was a Massachusetts ad that was, I don't know if we can play it, or let me try. Sure. This was done by many of the business groups. This was in support of the LGBT people during this referendum. It's very Boston.
Hey, think about it, kid. We bang Hueys wherever we want. No blinker. We cut you off on the pike, and then we slow it right the fuck down. And the second that light turns green, I'm honking.
Spoken like a true masshole.
We use our grandmother's furniture to save our parking spots. We drop ours and put them back in words that don't even have them. Manhattan clam chowder? The fuck is that? In New York sports teams?
Already golfing.
17 years, 10 championships.
11.
We'll still find something to bitch about on sports radio, and we'll remind you who the fucking GOAT is every 5 minutes. We cross the street wherever we want, because I'm a fucking pedestrian, and this is where I'm crossing. You know, our forefathers granted us this right to be loud, proud, occasionally obnoxious. And that freedom is so important to us. So, who are we to take away our neighbors' liberties? Or revoke the law that protects their right to live a life free from discrimination? Or be biased against someone based on the gender they identify with? Yeah. We're massholes, but we're no assholes.
So it plays on a lot of stereotypes for Bostonians, which is that they don't follow the rules, and they are bad in traffic and other things. But it was a very, it was a powerful display of support. Oh, maybe because you went on. Yeah, so we did this research prior to the 2018 referendum, and we collected data 2 weeks before the election, and then just 48 hours after the election, which was a smaller sample of people who followed up. And we had 523 participants, 63% cisgender, 37% trans. Mostly white, a quarter of people of color. And what we found was that transgender, non-binary, and gender-diverse people reported much more anxiety about the referendum than cisgender LGBTQ people. And that the referendum-related anxiety they were reporting was positively related to depressive symptoms. Those with a history of gender victimization reported increased anxiety and depression. And those who were also really familiar with the referendum, so they were probably fighting against it or doing work on behalf of it. And those who were exposed to negative messages reported greater anxiety as well. And then in terms of post-election, these were significantly different in the smaller sample that took both. Except for social support, which you would expect to not change in that time. We also collected qualitative data related to this. This person was not somebody who commuted to Massachusetts, but they reported, I do not live in Massachusetts. However, a no vote is still very dangerous for the transgender community in New England as a whole. I'm terrified for the community and our safety. They wanted to share the messages they felt about the referendum. These are some of the examples of what people wrote. So fortunately, the vote did not pass, and the rights were retained for transgender people. But what's important, I think, is that these ballot measures that we've shown over and over is that it puts people's rights to vote even when the outcome is expected to go favorably. So we were expecting that we would not, that the rights would be retained. We were expecting it to go in our favor as LGBTQ people, but it's still, for many people in the community, this was a very heightened experience of anxiety and depression. Those who are reported, and those who are being targeted by the legislation, such as transgender people, may be more vulnerable to these attacks. And just that you live in a progressive place, like we live in Massachusetts, which is more progressive than many parts of the United States, doesn't protect people from that minority stress that can relate to these kinds of initiatives. And the threats of removal of these rights, even just the threat of that is experienced as very anxiety provoking. And I know that you all have some things like possibly coming around in this way. So now we've turned this year, in fact, is so much worse and so much more intensively. All these bills are just skyrocketing. So you can only imagine what it's like now for what trans people are going through. This was all adult sample in a progressive state, and the legislation was not expected to pass. So if you can imagine what it's like for folks living in Texas or Florida or Alabama, or where things are, I can stop. Community is important, but the social support could only go so far. It didn't make a huge amount of difference, because when somebody's, when a whole ballot measure is determining whether you can go to the bathroom safely or to the toilet safely, there's only so much your friends and family can do to support you. This is a political, systemic, structurally stigmatizing event. We can increase LGBT affirming supports and psychological interventions and services. And in fact, we want to create more interventions for people when this is going through it, because a lot of times people don't even realize some of the impact that they are experiencing, because it's still external to them, but you wouldn't believe some of the things people were saying, that they were like, I can't be around my friends right now because they keep talking about this and it's stressing me out too much. Really big behavioral changes. People saying, I'm just playing video games until this election is over. Really difficult coping mechanisms. Resilience. People were talked about the anger that they experienced that was motivating them to make phone calls, to get out against the vote. Advocacy and activism are key, and focusing on the community is one of the rallies that was happening. And then contextualizing an anti-LGBTQ initiative. This can be helpful to take a movement perspective, that for a lot of what we're experiencing as communities are backlashes, or we take 2 steps, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, that this will be a really challenging time where we are right now with this transgender assault on transgender rights, but hoping that we can move forward over time. And I actually, I have a critique on that as well, because I also work in places where that's probably, was looking good and doesn't look so good now. So, but we can try to keep that long perspective. And in terms of helping our clients with this kind of stress, is normalizing and normalizing it like this. There is research showing that people do have different stressors around this. You could do values exercises. What do you value? Role models, contextualizing, group work with other LGBT individuals. And you can do in-depth stigma work. So you can explore the threats. Where is this anxiety? Where's this concern coming from? What's it like when people are talking about this issue? And to think about the context, and also focus on positive aspects. So I'm going to stop there so that we have a little time for talking. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Horne, for your excellent presentation. Let's come to the fourth. Maybe we can have a little time for the discussion with the remaining time. So we can take the seats in the front. There are some questions online. Maybe Martin can see. So we have some time left for the discussion. So I would first open the floor for the audience if you have some questions. Before you think about your potential questions, I would like to ask you, Professor Horne, so your research is very important that you find proof for that public ballots that have the traumatizing effects, as if the public was more expert in deciding than the researchers or evidence that they may tap into in different ways. Do you have some ideas about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's motivating people to get to the polls, right? I mean, if you can play on people's fears and anxieties, and especially when you're using a minority group to do that people may not know well or don't know people, it can be a very effective organizing tool to get people to back popular. It should get people to the poll to vote against it because you're playing on people's fears and anxieties. And I think it's been effective. I think it's changed. I think actually what's indicative right now is that a lot of this is anti-transgender, which I think that it shows that there has been some movement and some change that playing on anti-LGB is not as effective because more people know LGBT people now. It's more, it's more in the society. It's represented in the media more. This is a very convenient, very small population to basically use in a way to amplify people to get to the votes, to get to vote.
So it's more an issue of polarizing the voters so that they can be mobilized to support some parties. So this is a pattern that we can see in the Central and Eastern Europe in some countries.
Absolutely. The use of moral panic, of getting people all worked up over things. I mean, there's all these bills right now around trans.
Maybe, yeah. Hold it for a little while, and if it's not working, maybe just use another one.
Yeah, for example, there's a lot of votes in states on excluding young trans children from sports, and there's like one or two people in the entire state who it's creating problems that are not existing. So it's definitely using moral panic and a very established, social ways of doing things. Definitely.
So I don't know if we already have another question or if we have a question online.
There's just a comment.
A comment, so maybe you can read a comment.
So thanks to Vanda Hojnošová, who wrote, "Thank you so much for your work, both to the authors of the Czech studies and to Professor Horne. As a recent graduate of psychology and alumnus of a high school scholarship in Utah, and noticing a rise in conservative waves in politics in Central Europe and USA as well, I am so saddened by what is happening, but grateful for your work and hopeful that mental health professionals will be better informed and more sensitive to the issues in the future."
So I would like to thank for that comment, and based on that comment, I would ask another question that I'm sure Dr. Horne can tell us a bit more about. So your research worldwide, and specifically also in the Central and Eastern Europe, was to recognize the importance of psychological associations and societies in their affirmative practices, in the affirmation of LGBTQ+ issues. So would you say something about how this development is going on these days? What about the ISINET statement, and what is the progress now in your view?
Yes, I mean, it's been really remarkable to see the response that we've received from all over in different regions of the world of psychological associations signing on and supporting this statement and commitment to non-pathologization of LGBTQ identities and lives, and also just just stating the importance of affirmative practice, because on the other side, I've done lots of research with clients who keep telling, that had recent therapy in different parts of the world, including the US, where they experienced conversion therapy. They experienced active attempts to have their gender and sexual identities changed by therapists. And there's even, we're doing more work now on this in surveys, but there's also very subtle ways of doing that therapists are engaging in that, which is also often using using the ways that we are supposed to practice ethically by saying, using some of the ways that we are supposed to be ethical practitioners to actually question people's LGBT identities and developmental concerns. So I think it's vital at the national, organizational level for psychological associations to make a strong stand, so that because we can't train everybody effectively. I mean, we know that training takes time. The research we just did in Colombia showed that the more trainings people had, the more competent they were, the more knowledgeable, the better more clinically prepared they were. But there are just not enough trainings and people to do that work. So it's another important layer for psychological associations and organizations to say, this is what we believe in and this is what we are supporting. And that sends a message to members that this is unethical treatment would not be tolerated.
Thank you. So we have a question. Martin, maybe can you hold her? Yes, because of the online.
Yeah, actually, I have two questions. One would be, like at the start of your presentation, you mentioned that the research was made pre-pandemic, and I wanted to ask, like, what do you think the pandemic would influence in
Yes.
this matter? Yeah.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and so during the pandemic, I did a poll. I would call it a poll because I didn't have any aspiration to call it anything more than just a glimpse of what might be happening. So at the first wave in spring 2020, we did a poll where we asked questions on well-being and suicidality among both straight and sexual minority and trans participants. And we did another wave in spring 2021. And since those samples were relatively small, so we had, in first sample, we had something like 400 sexual minority participants, and in the second sample, we only had around 100 participants that were sexual minority because of some probably fatigue connected with COVID polling at the time. We saw increases in suicidality, in psychological distress, in both groups, straight and sexual minority. And there is research worldwide that was focusing on it and had resources and tools that focused on it. And I'm sure that you would expand upon that answer, maybe. So if we have the microphone, then maybe I would ask you for extending my answer, Dr. Horne.
I mean, it's so great that you did that. I think that's really important work. There's a whole lot that's come out since COVID, and there's been a special issue recently also that I haven't read fully, but I do. And we had a paper that with college students that's currently under review that found that LGBT and trans students were much more anxious, much more having a lot more challenges, and they reported that it compounded some of the concealment issues, because sometimes they had to move back home, they were back in some abusive environments, but out of a large sample of college students, we found that there was increased, that for LGBTQ students, it was much more severe.
Yeah, and expanding upon that, when we saw some of the data that we are about to publish, and that we've proven some associations, we saw the importance of social support that is originating from outside of the family. So if you are in lockdown, and if you are in lockdown with your family, or if you are locked down alone and you can't visit your friends and participate in events that may support you, which means you are restricted of access to a very important source of resilience and buffering effects. So that may be a partial explanation for specific problems, but also for the general population's problems. So do we have another comment or question online?
I had a second question.
Okay, of course.
If I can have it like in a row.
Yes, of course. We still have time maybe for another question.
Yeah, thank you for your answer in the first place. And second question was, you spoke about by women being more prone to, being more affected by the minority stress and this stuff. So I wanted to ask if this is like specific to the Czech Republic, or if you can see similar things in the world, and also what contributes to them, if so.
I will leave Professor Horne to have her thoughts about the question. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's a common finding in the U.S. literature, Western literature as well. And there's different theories about it, and some of it is that, there's, which Michal talked about earlier, just not having, often not feeling part of the LGBTQ community, and also not feeling part of straight community, so not being invisible in that way. There's some theories around identity formation, that people who identify as sexual minorities who then become gay or identify as gay or lesbian, they have more of a a community aspect to that, developmental support kind of process through that. So those are some couple of things. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's like there's a lot of to do on that resort, and something has been said already. So we hope that research will expand upon that. Thank you.
And just also lack of representation in the media as well. Often like you'll find bisexual people when they're represented in the media, it's they're the evil protagonist often, or but we did a study on portrayals of bisexuality with Katy Perry versus Janelle Monáe videos, and I can share that with you if you'd like. It was interesting because there's just a lot of portrayals around bisexuality that are really problematic.
So thank you. I think we are running out of time already, so I would like to invite all of you to write us your questions or approach us later on via our contacts. We are here. We can answer your questions later on. And I would really want to thank for your time, and I would want to thank you, Professor Horne, for joining us and for being here. And we just have a little present for you, so that you took your way to here. There are some Czech specialities, and so thank you for being here with us, and thank you all for participating, even online or offline.